Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LEC season finals, semifinals, and finals overview and analysis video. Definitely a bit weird to say that just with how everything works out in terms of the naming structure here in the LEC, but you guys know what I'm here to cover, the two final series of the LEC season domestically. We know the three teams that are going to be representing the LEC at the World Championships, but how will they be seeded? How will they be ordered going into that tournament? We are going to find that out here today. Of course, a lot more than that on the line. Not only are we going to know the seeding of these teams going to Worlds, but one of these teams will be crowned the LEC champion for 2024. I believe that's kind of a fair enough way to say it. Obviously, we've had our winter and spring and summer split champions in G2, but they're going to have the chance to do the quad over the course of this year by picking up one final trophy. Will they be able to do it, or will one of the other two teams stand in their way? We will have to see. Of course, if you want to know my thoughts on the tournament leading into this, check out the videos up in the iCard right now. That's the playlist for everything we've done so far in the LEC in the summer split. So that's the entirety of the regular season, the entirety of the playoffs, and the entirety of the season finals up until this point. Every single game has been done in a similar format, but today, of course, we are just going to be covering the final two series, the semifinals and the finals. So strap in. We've got a lot to discuss. If you are new here, what we are going to do in this video is go game by game in both of the series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of the video, we will be kind of giving a big overview and a send-off to the LEC in 2024 as we are wrapping up every domestic game here today. So, without further ado, let's jump right into the analysis. Three teams remain, and two of those teams are down in the lower bracket. Fnatic obviously awaiting the results of the semifinals, them having won winners finals, but who is going to take them on? Well, it's going to be an interesting matchup, at least to kick off our video here today, between the number 4 seeded Mad Lions Koi and the number 1 seeded G2 Esports. And saying it in that order is certainly not the anticipation of what we thought we were going to get going into this tournament, but honestly, Mad Lions being here at all is not the anticipation of what we thought we were going to get going into this tournament. This is a very interesting matchup. These two teams did play in round number 1. They played in the first series of the entire tournament. And in by far the biggest upset of the LEC season so far, Mad Lions was able to take that series in 5 games. G2 were overwhelming favorites going into that, rightfully so. I think that there were a lot of reasons to be excited about G2. They've won, up until this point, 6 of the last 7 championships here in the LEC. This is maybe the most dominant run we have ever seen from any team in European League of Legends history. And so for G2 to go down in round number 1, and for it to be a team like Mad Lions, who was, quite frankly, not very good in the summer split, and that's probably putting it politely. It certainly was a shock, to say the least, but Mad Lions proved in that winners finals against Fnatic, they're not just a flash in the pan. They took them to 5 games, narrowly losing in that game number 5 and dropping down here to the semifinals, but they are going to be going to Worlds, and this team has a lot going for them. I think Mirwin has obviously shown that his weird, crazy picks in the top lane can work, but there are questions about whether or not he can execute at a similar level on champions that are meta, or if he has to resort to things that are a little bit more unprepared, things like the Nidalee, things like the Smolder that are going to be a little bit more out there in terms of matchups. Elyoya has been much better in this tournament than he was in the regular season, but he still hasn't been a standout star. Everybody knows that there are some questions about Supa and Alvaro, but anybody who's followed the channel is probably annoyed at hearing me say this by now. I'm probably the biggest Supa and Alvaro defenders. I think they have been the most consistent part of this Mad Lions team all year long. And then you've got someone like Fresskowy in the mid lane, who I think is honestly kind of underrated at this point. He obviously really struggled in summer, had a really rough end of the year, but for the most part, this year was actually a really big positive to Mad Lions overall, and I think generally speaking was awesome against Fnatic, was a big reason why this team beat G2 in round number 1 as well. If you get similar performances out of players like Fresskowy and like Mirwin as to what you got in round 1, and if you get some step-ups from players like Supa, who were very good against Fnatic, then all of a sudden things get a lot more interesting for Mad Lions, and there is a real shot that you end up moving on to the finals. But G2 are favorites in the series for a reason. regardless of the fact that they lost to Mad the first time these two teams played, there's really no reason not to expect G2 to come out on top against really anybody. And I've been criticized for saying that in the LEC over the course of this year. I've been criticized for saying that it feels like there is a gap between G2 and everybody else. But I need to see it to believe it. I need to see someone eliminate G2 from a tournament this year before I believe that anybody can do it, because no one has been able to do it. And that's even with G2 showing so many signs of weakness. This team obviously going down into the lower bracket, but being pretty dominant in that lower bracket run, outside of the fact that they had to reverse sweep BDS to get here in the first place. Outside of that series, they looked great against Giant X, and honestly, in the 3 games they won against BDS, they were definitely the better team. And so you feel like at least G2 was starting to figure something out going into this series, but the individual performances of some of these players has certainly not lived up to expectation recently. Players like Caps and Yike have really not looked all that good over the past couple of weeks. Caps in particular has definitely been kind of a standout in terms of, like, this guy's dominated all year long. He's the clear MVP. He's clearly the best player in Europe, and so far at this tournament, he's kind of just been a guy for this team. In fact, he's lost quite a few games for this team over the course of this tournament, so you need to see him start getting online and start clicking with the rest of this roster. Yike has really been out of form. He was amazing up until this point. I was really on the Yike train throughout basically all of the year leading into, like, I guess the summer playoffs, but he started to struggle down the stretch, even with them winning finals, and then that struggle has very much continued and carried over into this tournament. You have someone like Mickey X, who I think has had a really rough year, all things considered. Basically, with the exception of MSI, he's actually been a bit of a problem for this team, and a lot of his engages are very, very suspect. He's often way too far forward, way too over-aggressive in terms of how he's playing the map, and so pretending like G2 don't have their flaws, I think is a mistake, but it's G2. Like, all the players I just named, do you really trust that, like, Caps and Yike and Mickey X and someone like a Hansama or a Broken Blade, do you expect those players to underperform when it matters the most? That's just not been the career trend for them. Players like Caps and Mickey X and Hansama, specifically Hansama, they've gotten better in these big moments. They are big game performers, clutch performers, and so you would expect them to be able to step up when their back is against the wall, but they're going to have to do it now, and they're going to have to get their revenge because Mad Lions is standing in their way, and only one of these teams can end up making it to finals. Remember, the loser of this series also has, like, play-ins on the line. The loser of this is the 3 seed, which means that they go to play-ins instead of the Swiss stage at Worlds, and so another real big important reason to win this series for both of these teams, as if they needed another one. But the only way to find out who ends up taking this series home is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get right into it. The winner of game number 1 was Mad Lions. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0, and we are already starting it off with a bit of a bang. This was a great game for Mad. They just came out and performed really well on a pretty standard traditional comp, which is honestly a really bad sign for G2, a really good sign for Mad Lions that they can pick something that is by all means like a very conventional, a very standard, a very in-meta draft and actually just outplay G2, who are cooking up quite a bit on the other side of this. We will talk about it. I don't know what was going through the minds of G2 when they drafted this. Gwen jungle is genuinely an insane thing to pick here, and then Gwen plus Yasuo as your mid-jungle duo is even more insane of a thing to pick in this game number 1. I think their thought process must have been that it's game 1 and that you can probably get away with picking anything, but man, did it really not help them out in terms of getting momentum and getting pressure in this series. But congratulations to Mad Lions. They played great in this first game to take the lead, but I gotta do it, man. I gotta glaze them. I know people get really mad at me on this channel because apparently I'm 10 times higher on this player than everyone else is, but player of the game is gonna go to Supa. I don't understand what there is to hate about him as a player. He is a trash talker. He's incredibly mechanically talented. He's not particularly consistent, which is generally something that LEC fans love. I mean, you love Carzzy. I don't really see what the difference is between Supa and Carzzy, except for the fact that I think Supa could grow into an even better player than Carzzy in a couple of years or a year or so when he gets his feet under him. This is a phenomenal player and a phenomenal performance. Again, I'm going to die on this hill because I just don't get what people aren't seeing when it comes to him individually as a player. He is such an interesting, fun, young AD carry here in the LEC, a domestic player that I think this org can actively build around him. He had a phenomenal game here. I mean, again, he has really taken over some of the games in the season finals. He's been a big reason why Mad Lions has looked so good at this tournament so far, and he continued that streak. Hans is one of those players that you kind of just expect to play well in a lot of these big instances because that's been his career norm, is just playing really well in big moments, but Supa outplayed him in game number 1, which is a really cool sign. Alvaro obviously deserves a lot of shoutouts as well. It wasn't just Supa. I'm not trying to paint this as a 1v9. I thought that there were some awesome plays made by both Alvaro and Elyoya in some of these late fights that put Supa in some great positions to capitalize on that, whether it be with the bullet time or just generally the damage from Misfortune. You know, the Alistair setup is super important for that. The Maokai was super important for that, and so again, I don't want to try to paint the picture as if Supa's the only player on this team doing anything. I don't want to take anything away from his teammates, but I do want to commend Supa on the things that he's doing right. This was a very, very good Misfortune performance, and if you're able to play that champion at a high level, there is a real chance that she is just the strongest AD carry in the game at the current moment. So, very important game number 1 performance from Supa. Like I said, Alvaro, Elyoya looking good, Mirwin looking good on the top side. Boy, did they need a performance like this from him on something like a Kennen, something that is a lot more standard. You know, the big concern for Mirwin has been, can you only play off-meta stuff? Or more reasonably, can you only, like, really win on off-meta stuff? Or are you just gonna hope to go neutral on everything else? To see him pull out the Kennen here and just do really well, man, was I excited to see that. Like, the Kennen was really good this game, and he was in a lot of great positions. Frescowy was pretty solid, but generally less remarkable, I would say, on the Corki. He didn't need to be all that much in this game, but Supa definitely the standout in terms of damage, and Alvaro and Elyoya with some phenomenal setups this game. And then for G2 on the other side, there are real concerns here. Like, usually I can brush off a game 1 loss. They actually love to do this. G2 loves to lose game number 1. It's been the most traditional thing that they've done over the course of this year, is lose game 1 and then come back and win every other game the rest of the series. It's just kind of what they do. They've done it the past 2 years, ever since this format change. It feels like the history always repeats itself, but there is more to the story than just, oh, you know, G2 lost game 1 and they're going to bounce back. The way that they lost is the way that they've been losing a lot of games, and that makes me concerned. Caps is going to get dud of the game. He's just not locked in right now. He is not in form, and I don't know what the reason is. He was so dominant basically the whole year, you know, winter, spring, summer, every split. He was actively destroying games and winning them single-handedly for G2, dragging this corpse across the finish line at times. Players like Hans and Mickey and even Yike and Broken Blade at times were very inconsistent, and Caps was always the constant. For him to be the player that's underperforming right now, it's very concerning, but the Yasuo just was not it. Now, I do want to say, most of this game I think can be attributed to the champion rather than the player. Yasuo just had no chance in this matchup, and obviously he didn't have much support from his jungle here with Yike on the Gwen, but at the end of the day, he has to be good enough to be able to win these games, and regardless of whether or not I think it's a draft problem, if he's completely irrelevant in these situations, that's his fault. If Yike's irrelevant in this situation, that's his fault. He's got to be able to fix that. No more Gwen. Do not cook this up anymore. We have overcooked whatever we are trying to figure out here in the jungle. I'm not even really going to touch upon it. The Gwen was fine in isolation, but it offered so many open holes for Mad Lions to take advantage of macro-wise in the mid game, and they absolutely did that. Maokai is just way more consistent in that phase of the game. Mickey was fine. Broken Blade was fine. Hans was fine. They weren't the problems in this game. Mid-jungle definitely felt the most exploitable, but quite frankly, this was just Mad Lions being more proactive and being better. Maybe that's because they had more tools at their disposal in terms of their draft, but maybe it's because they are in such good form right now and they are able to just take another series against G2. You're up 1-0 now. If you can go up 2-0, like obviously G2 has shown that they're resilient and they can come back from that, but I mean, it's a pretty damn good position to be in, and you would love to put yourself in that. Can G2 even up the series at 1 apiece? Because I feel like that's kind of necessary for them, or is Mad going to take that dominant lead here? Well, the winner of game number 2 was G2 Esports, they are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up the series at 1 apiece, G2 taking G2. It's always quite appropriate for that to be the outcome, but this was much better from G2. This is much more of what I expected coming into the series, with Mad pulling out some weird things in draft. I mean, really just the Smolder top. I mean, the triple marksman, it's kind of their thing at this point. It's kind of the thing that they like to do, and Smolder, I think, is a good pick for that up on the top side, but G2 clearly has this more scouted than, quite frankly, the actual comps that are meta right now, because they looked significantly better trying to play into whatever Mad Lions was cooking up in this game, as opposed to whatever they were attempting to do in game 1, which was the standard thing. And so for G2, that's definitely a bit of an interesting conundrum. I'm sure they prepped a lot for a lot of the weird Mirwin picks on the top side, but really the big difference in this game is very obvious. It's Brand. It's Yike getting mega fed, and he's gonna get player of the game. There's obviously no one else that I could give this to outside of the Brand. He was infinitely strong in this one. I mean, this was an incredible game from Yike, and boy, did he need to have this. Truly, he has been the worst player on G2 over the past month or so, which is super unexpected. Like, it just is not something I ever really anticipated with how he started the year. I think he's developed a ton as a player coming into the league. He was kind of known as an exclusive carry player. Wasn't really somebody that you wanted on a facilitator or somebody that you wanted in more of a tangential role to the team. You wanted him to be kind of the primary focal point, but as he's grown as a player, really by the end of last year, he had turned into a really good facilitator, somebody who was really good on things like Sejuani and Ivern and Maokai and a lot of these other LEC staple picks. And going into this year, I had really high expectations of him, and he honestly blew those out of the water at the start of this split. He was incredible in winter, really good in spring, really good in summer, and then playoffs happened, and everything just kind of collapsed around him, and I wasn't really sure what the reasoning behind that was, but here we are when it really matters, and again, he is stepping up. Now, it wasn't all him. Obviously, it takes a village to try to get Brand super far ahead. I'm kidding, obviously. Brand is super easily turned into this absolute monster that just cannot be taken down, but there was a lot of help here from G2. Mickey X, I thought, had a really good game on the Rakan. He was really the primary, I would say, facilitator this game in terms of setting Yike up, but a really good game from Broken Blade in the top side on Cassante. This is, again, a matchup that I'm sure he prepped a lot for. I'm sure the Smolder, the Nidalee, a lot of these, specific weird off-meta picks were very much on his radar, and so when you get better performances out of players like that, and Caps is actively winning in the mid lane, and Hansama's not getting absolutely obliterated in the bot lane like he did in game number 1, all of those things coming together allows Yike to play a lot more aggressive and allows him to be much more of a carry, and he definitely took advantage of it. But easy choice for player of the game, and generally G2, I just thought, played around him better. This was a really clean game from them, and they kind of dominated it from start to finish. And then for Mad on the other side, going to old reliable might not exactly be the best strategy in a series like this, especially if G2 is going to come out and just be like, hey, actually, we scouted you. We knew what we were getting into. You've played a lot of these weird champions, and we were prepared for that. It very much felt like Mad had less of an advantage on these off-meta picks than they did on the actual meta. Whether that's because those champions are just straight up better, because they are, I don't know, but Mad has always been a team that's better when they are in their own zone, and so it's definitely an interesting game number 2 to try to monitor, but dud of the game could go quite a few ways. I ended up giving it to Frescowy in the mid lane. Just didn't think the Ezreal was good. Triple Marksman is very, very difficult to pull off if you're Ivern or if you're Leona. Aren't in particularly great positions, and they weren't in this game, but the Ezreal didn't do anything. If you're going to R5 a champion like that, especially because you're flexing Smolder into the top lane, you have to be able to make it worth it, and Frescowy really has been a good player. He was really good into caps last time these two played. It just didn't really show up in this game. Elyoya was the other player I very much considered for dud of the game, because this wasn't a particularly good performance from him on the Ivern. I think the jungle gap was very noticeable, probably the most noticeable of anybody in this game. That was probably the biggest difference between, one particular matchup, but it's Ivern. Like, at the baseline level, he was useful. I just don't think Elyoya had a particularly strong performance, and quite frankly, I think Yike was just better in every aspect. Of course, that reflects in the result, but Alvaro, not exactly ideal on the Leona. Mirwin, Supa, they were along for the ride. The Smolder was entirely useless in this game. The Cassante was way more valuable on the other side of this matchup, and Supa couldn't quite take over the game in the same way that he could in game number 1, just wasn't, given the same kind of opportunities and resources, but Mad is still in this series. It is still just tied up at 1 apiece. It's not like it's over by any stretch of the imagination. If they win game 3 and get back into the win column and, take back control of this series, then everything changes once again, but if G2 G2 is able to wrestle control for Mad Lions, that could be a really tough situation. You don't want to have to win 2 games in a row against G2. But is Mad going to be able to take control of the series, or will G2 be able to go up for the first time here? The winner of game number 3 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to go up in this series for the first time, 2-1, and they have taken full control. It feels like Mad is a little dejected after some of the games in this series. There's really only one player that was like attempting to win this. Shout out Supa. He was doing stuff in this game. You know, some setups by Alvaro. I don't think it was all Supa, but that's about as good as I can give Mad in this game, if I'm being entirely honest. Even I can't give them really anything else, because this was just a bad game from them, even if the scoreline doesn't necessarily indicate that. This wasn't one of those games that felt like it was unwinnable for Mad Lions after 10 minutes or whatever, but they just kept making mistake after mistake, and just these small isolated issues that they just couldn't seem to solve, and eventually G2 was able to take advantage of all of those and push towards the victory. Player of the game was so simple, so easy in this one to choose from. It's obviously going to Hansama in the bot lane. He couldn't miss an arrow to save his life. Now, how much of that is him and how much of it is that Mad Lions just completely refused to flash an arrow, like just did not want to use their flash to dodge an Ashe arrow at any point in this game? You know, it's up to you to kind of determine the importance of that, but Hans was still super important towards this game overall. Obviously, the bot lane is what really stands out for G2 in this one. Both Hans and Mickey were tremendous and really kind of set this team apart in terms of kind of the expectation for what I'm looking at for the rest of this run. Whether it be just the rest of this series or if they win it and go on to the finals, the bot lane is going to need to be a pretty pivotal piece of that because, you know, Caps is certainly somebody that you would expect to start stepping up, but it's not really been there over the course of this tournament. Yike has looked unbelievably good on the brand so far. He dominated game 2, looked very good here in game 3, but you don't really know what he's going to look like off of that champion at the current moment, and Broken Blade has looked better on things like tanks in the top lane just to stabilize the rest of this consistent late game, and so it is a lot of this is actually on the bot lane, more than maybe you would expect if you just watched G2 in the regular season, and Hans is kind of the player that you would most want to step up into that role, which is a really good thing to say. It's been very fun watching Hans kind of make that development on G2 in particular, because when you look at his time, and this is not necessarily true, but obviously, you know, some of the teams in the past for him have not necessarily done as well domestically as you would want. I'm really just looking at the one-team Liquid year, but outside of that, Hans has been a really big playoff performer, a really big Worlds performer, whether it's been on Misfits or on Rogue or now here on G2. He's basically performed everywhere he's needed to, and he's stepped up in the clutch when it matters the most, and that really has, like, exacerbated here at G2. He has become the clutch player for this team, and it's really cool to see that. He just constantly dominates in these high pressure, you know, finals type situations, big stadium games. That's where you want Hans to step up, and that's where he has been stepping up. But Mickey deserves a lot of credit for it as well. It wasn't a one-man show or anything, but it definitely was the bot lane that stood out the most for G2 and kind of pushed them on to this victory, both in terms of damage and in terms of playmaking and setup for a lot of the plays they wanted to make. And then for Mad on the other side, like I said, this game really is their fault. Like, this was just a bad game from Mad Lions. They didn't play particularly well. Dud of the game could go to quite a few people, but honestly, the way I want to describe this is this very much felt like a summer split regular season game for Mad Lions, where the top side of the map is just unplayably bad. You have Mirwin, Elyoya, Frescowy getting completely outplayed, and the bot lane's like trying to do things. They're trying to stay aggressive, trying to pull back some gold, but it's just not really enough because the top side of the map is getting destroyed. That was basically the entirety of the summer split regular season, and that's what we got here in game 3. Mirwin is going to get dud of the game. If there's anyone to complain about not flashing this game, you know, taking every Ashe arrow, even when he absolutely did not need to, it is Mirwin in the top lane. I just can't begin to comprehend what must have been going through his head when he just decided, yeah, I'll eat every single Ashe arrow that comes my way as Smolder, and I'll just refuse to get ahead. I'll just die in all these fights. Who cares? It doesn't matter. Like, I just don't understand what the point of it is. If you're gonna pick something like Smolder, and if you're gonna play for it on the top side, then, like, actively try to invest in keeping him alive in a lot of these situations, and if you're Mirwin, then maybe it might be a good idea to try to flash the Ashe arrow to try to stay alive. It just feels like a very bad game, a very out-of-character game, because because it just feels like a lack of effort. It feels like a lack of care. This is what I was saying towards the end of the regular season with Mad, where they would just kind of turn their brains off and play this ego check mechanical game that they couldn't win. That's how Game 3 felt, but they're 1-1 in the semifinals against G2. This just feels like a very odd time for those problems to come out, so I don't particularly understand it. Elyoya wasn't very good. Was Fresskowy even in the game? I mean, did Yone do anything throughout this entire one? And to that matter, like, where is Sejuani? Why is she just completely out of this meta? If you're going to pick something like Yone, and even if you're going to pick something like Smolder, Sej actually works super well with this comp, and I get you're lacking AP damage, but who's exactly building the armor on the other side of the map that's going to make you completely not do any damage, right? Like, you've got a brand Corki Ashe. You're always going to do damage in this game, and so I just don't really understand the idea behind it. I think Fresskowy was literally useless. Elyoya was bad. Mirwin was bad. Supla and Alvaro weren't exactly great, but they were at least trying to win the game. This was bad for Mad Lions, and uncharacteristically bad, as I said. They have to play better than this in Game 4, or of course they're done. If they lose this next game, they're going to be going into Worlds as the number 3 seed, which means that they don't make the Swiss stage. They make the play-in stage for a chance to make the Swiss stage. That's obviously not ideal for them, but not entirely unexpected. But for G2, you're one game away from moving on to finals where you probably expected to be all along. It's the long road to get there, but you are one game away, but you do have to win that one game. Matt has a very good shot of bringing this to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. They have done it in every series that they have played in the tournament up until this point. Are they going to get a chance to do it here? Well, the winner of game number 4 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to close out this series in 4 games with a 3-1 win, and they are moving on to our LEC season finals. Congrats to Mad for making it this far. That's already such a massive accomplishment, of course, with them being eliminated from the tournament here in 3rd place. That guarantees them the play-in spot from the LEC at the World Championships. Just the fact that they are at Worlds, I think, is already such a big positive for them. They certainly didn't expect to get there, I think, after the end of the regular season, really after the end of summer at all. But I think a lot of people forget that this was a team that went to finals in winter. This team has found success before, and honestly, they found quite a bit of success in this tournament. Not only did they beat G2, they took Fnatic to 5. They took another game off of G2 at the beginning of this series. There is upside to a team like Mad Lions that I think people aren't necessarily talking about. That, of course, we'll get into as we go further along in this segment, but we got to talk about the good things that G2 are doing. Obviously, I don't want to spend too much time on them right now because we're going to talk about them again in just a second when they take on Fnatic in the finals, but G2 was once again very good here in game number 4. Basically, every single game in this series was a bit of a blowout. None of them were all that close moving into the back half of the game, and that was once again the case here for game number 4. Hansama is not only going to get player of the game, but he's going to get player of the series as a whole. The damage he's able to output on Jhin is fantastic. Jhin is a champion we've seen do incredibly well in the playoffs, basically everywhere, specifically though in the LPL. It's really dominated in the LPL, and this is a champion that I think is very, very, very misjudged by a majority of the fan base. I continue to just believe that people don't watch Jhin games, that they just assume that Jhin is a low damage champion in the current meta, but he is not this kind of champion that can do absolutely nothing. Fourth shot will one-shot anybody on Mad Lion's side, and trust me, it did at times in this game. The ultimates are incredibly strong, and he does still offer the utility. It's not like the utility is gone just because he's now doing more damage. There is a reason that he has come back into the meta, and a big reason for that is because he can actively win team fights for his team now. So Jin's in a great spot, and Hans obviously piloted him well. Again, Hans just continues to be great. Basically, every player of the series that I've given G2 over the course of this year has been either Caps or it's been Hansama, and honestly, I think Hans has been Finals MVP all 3 times this year for me. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure somebody else knows in the comments. I think one time it was Caps, maybe in winter. I could be wrong about that, but Hans is just one of those guys that steps up in these best of 5s that really knows how to play these long extended series and really plays better as we get further along into games, 3, 4, 5 in these long series. So credit to Hansama, he continues to look great here. But I want to give a big shout out to Mickey X as well. I've been very, very critical of Mickey's performances over the course of this year. I think that there are a lot of people that look at how he played at MSI and just assume that's how he's played all year, because understandably, there are a lot of people that don't watch a lot of the domestic games, that certainly don't watch a lot of the regular season games, and maybe don't even watch all of like the best of threes and playoffs or anything like that when it comes to the LEC. And I'm not trying to knock that. That's a big reason why I started the channel, is to try to update people on, what's happening, maybe if they couldn't watch the games. But I do think that there is this sentiment that some of the Mickey hate is unfounded, or at least isn't quite as grounded in reality because he was good at MSI, that he couldn't have been as bad in the domestic season. But trust me, as somebody who watched every single game of the LEC this year, there were multiple games that Mickey made as close to unwinnable as possible as you could make a team of Caps and Hansama and Yike and Broken Blade, right? Like, there were games that Mickey just couldn't win. Hylissang got so much hate over the course of this year for basically being the exact same player that Mickey X was. The difference is that Mickey had a better team around him. That being said, Mickey has certainly gotten back into form, and we did kind of expect this. This is pretty regular for Mickey X. Even number years aren't exactly his bread and butter. He was awful in 2022 for Excel. I think people tend to forget just how horrible he was in that year, so it's not shocking to see him have some ups and downs, but as long as he's getting into form when we are getting into these important games, that's all that really matters, and he was really, really good in this series, and that's a very important thing. I do also want to shout out Yike. I think he's going to go a little bit under talked about in this series for how good he was. Game 2 was a massive jungle gap, and quite frankly, all 3 of G2's wins were a massive jungle gap in favor of Yike. The fact that they allowed him to have Brand 3 games in a row to me is astounding. That's really not good for Mad Lions in my opinion, but Yike definitely made the most of it. Caps had his best game of the series by far here on the Corki. It ends up going 4-0 in this series. Corki's not broken or anything, but he certainly is one of the more consistent mid laners and does open up a wide variety of options in the surrounding team, which I think is beneficial. Broken Blade was solid here on the Aatrox, but overall, G2, like, what I'm taking away from this is that bot lane was really, really good, definitely the carry of the team in this game, and then Yike was also really solid, and if those 3 players are going to step up, this team is going to be nearly unbeatable domestically, just because there aren't a lot of players in those roles that can actually compete with the talent level that G2 has, and they're moving on to finals to go and prove that. But for Mab, like I said, this is the end of their run. They are going to be going out in 3rd place, but 3rd is really not bad. I think they would have loved to have played better in these final 2 games. Games 3 and 4 were their least competitive, probably of the entire tournament, even going back to round number 1, which is never ideal. Dud of the game is going to go to Supa here in game number 4. There was really no conversation here. Supa was not good at all in game 4. The only sad thing is I do think people are going to look at Supa a lot more negatively after this series because he wasn't good in game 4. Even if he was probably the best player on this team in this series as a whole, like games 1 through 3, he was pretty good in all of them. Specifically the first 2 games I thought he played really well, but you're bad in the final game of the series, you're the worst player in the closeout game, now you're the problem, you're the scapegoat, so that's just kind of how it ends up operating. Elyoya was significantly worse to me throughout this series. They did actually pick up the Sejuani here in game 4 as I recommended alongside the Yone. I think the Gwen actually pairs very well with this. I like the draft here from Mad, but they just don't have the tempo to be able to actually take advantage of it. A big part of drafting Sejuani into something like Brand is you do have to be able to establish tempo early and get a lead in some lane, like somewhere, to be able to play through, and they just weren't able to do that. Elyoya was quite frankly just completely out-jungled in this series, and I'm pretty out on the train of Elyoya being like a top 1 or 2 jungler like I was going into the year. He's not there anymore. Or at least he's not there at the current moment, and I think that's been proven over the past couple of months. Frescow, we never really looked all that comfortable on the Yone, even though I know it's one of the champions he plays a lot of. Like Alvaro, Mirwin, they were along for the ride. Mirwin was generally okay on the Gwen, but they were never actually going to be able to play through him. Like, there were some positives and negatives, but Mad kind of getting obliterated as G2 got further and further into form, further and further along into this series. And so for Mad, obviously it sucks, but you're the 3rd seed going to Worlds. You can only be so upset with this outcome, and for G2, you're going on now to finals. This was only one of the 2 series you needed to win this weekend in order to complete this ridiculous year, to win the quad, if you will, here in the LEC. They've already won the triple, so we'll see if they can get it done, but it's definitely not going to get easier from here. But that's going to bring us to our 2nd series of the video, and it's the big one, the 2024 LEC Season Finals. The championship game here, we get to determine who our 2024 LEC champion will be, who will be going to Worlds as the number 1 seed, and who will have to settle for being the runner-up. Of course, it's a matchup between the number 2 seeded Fnatic and the number 1 seeded G2 Esports that we just watched qualify. this is a very fun series. I mean, the two most prestigious organizations in the LEC by a country mile, facing off for what feels like the billionth time in a pretty pivotal final. The problem for Fnatic is it hasn't exactly gone well for them in recent memory. This is not exactly a matchup that has been particularly advantageous for Fnatic. Obviously, historically, this team has not been able to overcome G2 in a lot of these pivotal finals. We're talking about a gigantic gap in time here where Fnatic has just been losing to G2 in these finals over and over again. I want to say it was 2018 spring, that was the last time they beat them. I could be wrong about that. I'm sure somebody in the comments will correct me if I'm wrong. The year might be wrong. I know it was the spring split sometime to go to MSI. Rift Rivals was definitely still a thing, and I want to say it was 2018 because I think that was the year that we had that weird 100 Thieves situation, but I could be wrong. Again, I'm sure the LEC historians will let me know. Sometimes when you watch all of these regions, the years, the specific numbers start to bleed together. But regardless, it's been forever since Fnatic's been able to beat G2 in a final that has actually mattered. And now they're sitting here in probably the best position they've been in to do so in a while. Not only are they playing really good League of Legends right now, but G2 is very beatable, or at least you would assume that they are more beatable than they have been recently because of their recent form. Now, that series against Mad Lion certainly inspires more confidence, but what does Fnatic have to do in order to enable themselves? Well, this is probably the most feast or famine team in the LEC in terms of their playstyle. They are addicted to getting early game leads when they are able to play within their own comfort zone, when they're able to play off of a really high early tempo game where they can snowball things out of control. All of a sudden, they become probably the scariest team in the LEC to have to deal with. The problem is that when they're taken out of that comfort zone, when Razork or Humanoid or even Noah have to play from disadvantaged states, they're not really all that good at that. They're just not a particularly good team at having to try and come back in a lot of these games. And so you really don't trust them to be super consistent in a lot of high-profile series, or at least I haven't trusted them to be particularly consistent just purely because of that. But honestly, their best comparison, if you want a global comparison right now, is Weibo Gaming. I think they're very similar in terms of playstyle. Maybe Weibo's a bit more mechanically intensive, but Razork and Humanoid can beat anybody in the LEC. On any given day, Fnatic can win any series if they're able to get strong leads in the early game. The problem is, are you going to be able to get those consistently against a team like G2 that is very, very good and very good at getting those early game leads in their own right? That is going to be the question. If Fnatic can come out and really start strong in this series with the win, not only, winning game number one, but if they can come out and show hey, we can play our game and we can beat you that way, that's going to be pretty huge for them. But if G2 come out and say all right, we're shutting that down, your early game aggression, Razork, you're going to have to play from behind. Humanoid, you're going to have to play from behind. I'm not sure that's going to go super well for Fnatic, and I think that is the concern in a series like this, and the reason that I think myself and a lot of other people consider G2 the heavy favorites to win a series like this. Obviously, Fnatic is undefeated so far in this tournament in terms of series. They won in round one, they won in winners finals to get here, and so that they are at the very least going to be a tough out. They're in good form. They're not running it down at the current moment, but I think a lot is going to have to go right, and honestly, they're going to have to play at their best in order for them to win. That feels obvious. A team shouldn't be able to win the LEC when not playing at their best, but so far throughout the year, G2 has gotten away with it just fine. So we'll see what happens with Fnatic here, but G2 are definitely my favorites coming into the series. But the only way to know whether or not that's going to be true is, of course, to go game by game, and that means starting with game one. So let's get into it. The winner of game number one was G2 Esports. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0. And unfortunately for Fnatic, it kind of was the opposite story of what we just talked about here. Sometimes you are able to get early game leads, and you've got a Smolder, and you've got a Sejuani, and you've got a Kennen, and yet you're still not able to close out the game. That's a really bad situation to end up finding yourself in, but congrats to G2. Credit to them for sticking in this game and not giving up, for being able to make sure that they get that soul, make sure that they get that Elder, always trying to pressure that Baron, for constantly trying to out macro, outside lane, and just outthink and outplay Fnatic in a lot of this game. That's what got them over the finish line. This is a pretty difficult game to win. The degree of difficulty for this G2 win is very high, but a lot had to go right in order for them to get here, not only on the side of G2, but a lot had to go wrong on the side of Fnatic in terms of the plays that they ended up making and the decisions they ended up making towards the back half of this game. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game is going to go to Hansama. He ends off the last series as player of the series. He starts off the finals here as player of the game in game number 1 on the Kalista. You typically don't associate Kalista as being this champion that can take over 50 minutes into a game in these team fights. You often are picking Kalista because you want to dominate lane, you want to win the 1v1 super hard, and while that didn't exactly happen in the same way that maybe you would expect in this bot lane matchup, the Kalista ended up being very, very useful. I think Kalista is honestly underrated in the team fight stage of the game. I've always thought that she scales really well if you are able to give her consistent frontline access, like if you have like a Mundo or, you know, a Rakan in this to set up a lot of the plays and to buy her time. She just needs time. If you can give her that, she still can carry and take over a lot of these late game team fights, and I thought Hansama was great. One of the players whose score lines looks really bad that actually was really important towards this game, though, is Caps in the mid lane. I know 4, 7, and 8 doesn't exactly look super ideal for a Corki, and trust me, his early game was not. He had a lot of missteps in the early game. It really looked like he was going to be the reason that G2 ended up losing this game. However, as we shifted later and later, Caps took over, right? Like the Craps version of him that was playing in lane, where he was just kind of relying on his mechanics. Okay, whatever. Fnatic is very good mechanically. They're one of the few teams, Humanoid is one of the few players that can actually go toe-to-toe with someone like Caps in lane and live to tell the tale. But the difference between Caps and every other player is his ability to affect the map without gold, whether that be through just being in the right place at the right time or side laning in particular at really, really bad times for Fnatic. He was able to create pressure in situations where he should not have been nearly as useful as he actually was. This was a macro masterclass, quite frankly, from Caps, and you just have to be impressed with that. Even when his micro was failing him, like it kind of is right now, he still is able to create such a gigantic impact on the game overall because he is so knowledgeable and he's got such a good understanding of where he needs to be at all points in time. This guy is just crazy good, and honestly, if I'm a mid laner anywhere in the world right now, I'm studying Caps to figure out how to be useful, even without resources in a meta where that feels like it should theoretically be impossible. So credit to Caps. Yike continued to look pretty good, at least in the late game. Again, his objective-focused mentality towards the back half was very important towards their success. The Mundo didn't exactly work, but it didn't exactly fail either. Mickey was generally very good in this game, but, you know, just kind of a team effort from G2 sticking in there and keeping their head about them and being able to walk out of this with a win. Again, it was all just about patience and about making sure you were the one to walk out of that final fight with a victory, which is the only one that ended up mattering. And then for Fnatic on the other side, heartbreaking game 1 loss. If you would have taken a 1-0 series lead, I think you would have felt a lot better about the situation you were in, but alas, that early lead that you generated is you're just not able to close it out, and it's a bit disappointing. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Oscar Rinnin. I didn't feel like it could really go to anybody else. Not only was he targeted a bit by G2 in terms of the resources that they wanted to put into him, but honestly, a lot of his Kennen engages were just bad. If you're able to shut down the Kennen instantly in a lot of these fights, that champion just doesn't really do a lot. We're seeing that in the LCK in particular, where that champion has actually had like negative success. It's been pretty successful elsewhere, North America and the LPL. Both of those regions, I think, have had really good success with a champion like Kennen, but if you are able to just shut it down, if the flank angle isn't exactly there, if you're not able to, you know, correctly line that up and, you know, create these big opportunities, and specifically if you aren't like super strong coming out of the early game, you're not exactly a champion that's just going to like walk in and do everything that he wants to do. Like it's a lot more difficult to execute on Kennen now than it was like a year or so ago, and I think Oscar had to learn that the hard way. And then you had these fed members of the team that just weren't really doing anything. Like Noah was good this game, but he wasn't exactly taking over fights on the Ezreal. That wasn't his job, though. You have a Smolder in the mid lane, and Humanoid really wasn't doing anything. Like Smolder was doing a ton of damage, but he was just sitting there watching G2 fight. Like he was so scared, so passive, and I think that's a really good way to kind of encompass what Fnatic did in this game. They got this early lead, and then it felt like they panicked, and they felt like they couldn't close it out because of everything that happened in the summer playoffs, and that led them to be very indecisive in terms of how they played the end game, and it led them to lose this, and that's the problem with Fnatic. We've talked about this when they're in their comfort zone, when they get to play from ahead, when they know what they're supposed to do, they're really good. But the moment they lose that confidence, the moment they start doubting themselves, that's when players like Razork and Humanoid have really underperformed in the past historically, and that's never been more apparent than right now. This is a team that has a clear weakness, so we'll see if G2 can continue to exploit it, but Fnatic looked really good for most of this game. If they can bounce back and win game number 2, tie up the series at 1-1, that's kind of a 2-0 start to the series, and so there's definitely something to look forward to, but, you know, if G2 can get that 2-0, like, that's a really bad spot for Fnatic to be in. Having to win 3 games in a row against G2 Esports is just never going to be easy, so a big game number 2 here. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Fnatic. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and we've got ourselves a back and forth finals on our hands. We are at the very least going into game 3 all tied up, which is all we wanted to see, and this was a much better performance from Fnatic. G2 once again goes for this weird draft. I don't get Gwen jungle. I just don't understand like what the appeal of it is right now. Gwen is really strong. I think she is a very good fighter in the top lane right now, and you know, she can do a lot of things in the late game, but you're just going to get completely out-tempoed on something like Gwen jungle, and that's playing exactly into what Fnatic kind of wants you to do. I just don't really understand the idea behind it, and I will talk about that more when we get to G2, but one thing I do want to say, I had such a nice vacation, as you guys know. I was gone for a couple of days. I didn't post over the weekend. I was gone for Labor Day. I had such a nice vacation even before that as well, like going back a couple weeks or so. It really felt like things were opening up because it felt like it had finally stopped. All of these comments complaining about champions every single game, it felt like they had finally stopped, where it was like, okay, I can calm down and I can just focus on the analysis. I can talk about the players. I can talk about how the champions interact with each other. It's not just brainless talk about, oh, X champion is OP because he won 2 games in a row. Welcome back, everybody. It's finals, everybody's watching again, the casuals are in, and so every single comment on every single thread about this game is about Smolder. I don't even think, if you watch my channel, you probably know what I'm going to say on this. We've been watching Smolder for weeks in the playoffs in every other region, and nobody else is complaining about this because Smolder is very stoppable. Smolder is very dealable with, but if you're bad or if you're slow, you're not going to be able to deal with him. That's kind of the difference, right? Like, there is obviously a lot that this champion can do. There is a lot of free damage that he essentially gets for getting into the late game, but games aren't going 37 minutes in the LCK. They're not going 37 minutes in the LPL. This is an LEC problem. This is a problem that LEC teams have. There is a reason this champ is doing better in this region, and so I'm just going to touch on that very quickly. Smolder is not nearly, not even remotely half as broken as Reddit would make you believe. I've seen so many comments that Smolder better get gutted before Worlds. Smolder's just another marksman right now. Like, truly, what is the difference between Smolder and Zeri other than that Zeri is harder? Like, there is no real difference, in my opinion. I think Smolder's easier to execute on. Like, there are champions that I think are way more busted and that need significantly more tuning right now than something like a Smolder does. You know, yell at me in the comments if you think I'm stupid, but again, you would know this if you watched my other region reviews. We've been talking about Smolder for weeks, genuine weeks, months in those other regions, and no one is complaining about it over there because this champion is balanced if you're not just giving him everything he wants. And unfortunately for G2, when you pick Gwen jungle and Corki mid and Zeri in the bot lane and you have no agency and you're playing into Smolder, yeah, no shit the guy's gonna get to scale for free. So that's my rant aside. I don't know what they expected in this game, sitting here and saying that Smolder is broken because they played exactly into his win condition. It just feels like such a short-sighted thing to say, but again, you know, I had that vacation from LEC comment sections, which always seem to be the ones that boil my blood the most. But I digress. We move on to the actual analysis of the game. Humanoid is going to get player of the game because the Smolder did take over. But again, how much of this is Humanoid playing well and how much of this is G2 literally just giving him everything he wants? Like, the Smolder gets to scale essentially for free in this game, gets to these team fights and starts taking over. Yeah, that's what he does. That's the thing he's supposed to do. And Fnatic played around it really well. They had an Ivern, they had a Rel, they had a Cassante to set up for him, and by the end of the game, he could 1v9. That's the point of Smolder. And so, yeah, Humanoid's getting player of the game. He did his job. Razork was really good in that role. Jun was really good in that role of being able to, like, focus on the Smolder and set him up and make sure he's in a good position. But, you know, this was a Smolder game. Once they got him ahead, it was kind of over for the enemy team. For G2, though, you know, the biggest complaint I have is just I don't understand why you're going for these mega slow comps. I don't understand why you're not trying to actively contest Fnatic in the early game. And maybe I just don't understand Gwen jungle. Maybe that's my biggest problem. Maybe this is like secret tech that is actually super good pre-6 and has a ton of fighting potential and wants to skirmish early, but I just don't really see that. Like, I've never played this, and so I don't get the idea. To me, this is a very slow, like, jungle champion. Like, you just want to build up as much gold as possible so you can get to these mid to late game fights and be useful there, be like a genuine threat like a Gwen would normally be in the game. You're just doing it out of the jungle position. Like, I don't really see what she offers that's particularly different from top lane Gwen, except for the fact that you don't have a jungler in the game at that point. And so maybe I'm just not getting it. Again, maybe someone in the comments can explain to me how this champion is supposed to work, but now I've watched Yike play her twice and neither game has looked impressive at all. Both games, he's just lost tempo, and yeah, he's been able to fight, and yeah, he does a lot of damage, but it doesn't really matter. He's the jungler, and he's not affecting the map, and that's a bigger problem. Yike is going to get dud of the game for me because of this Gwen pick. If you're picking something super passive, and then you sit there and you go, oh, Smolder's broken, like, look in the mirror. Like, it just kind of is what it is. Like, at some point, you have to recognize the situation you put yourself in. I think Caps also having another bad game wasn't great here. I think Caps just being significantly worse than Humanoid, like, that's a really bad situation to be in. Even if Broken Blade, Hans, Mickey, even if they were generally fine throughout this game, which they were, if mid jungle's losing, like, that's already the most important part of the map, and there's a Smolder Ivern there now, so it's just not a great situation. G2 has no one to blame but themselves for this Game 2 loss, and honestly, this is kind of a 2-0 start for Fnatic. It's not quite that simplified, but there is definitely a lot of momentum in their favor, and depending on how things go in game number 3, we could really be looking at a scary situation for G2. If G2 is able to bounce back and take the 2-1 lead, all of a sudden they've regained control and they can stabilize things, but if Fnatic wins game 3, you're looking at a team that's looked better probably in all 3 games, especially, you know, games 2 and 3. We'll see how that goes, but you know, that's a really scary proposition for G2, so they definitely want to avoid it, but the most important game of the series, as you guys know for me, is coming up now. Game 3, when you're tied 1-1, it just doesn't get more important than that. Grabbing control of the finals is essential. Having to win 2 games in a row in the final 2 instead of just one of the final 2 is a much bigger hurdle. So, who's going to be able to take that advantage here in game 3? Well, the winner of game number 3 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to take back control of the series by going up 2-1, and they are now 1 game away from being your 2024 LEC champions. Fnatic couldn't quite hang on to the success that they had in game number 2, although at times they tried. I think that there were good moments for Fnatic in this game, but quite frankly, I hate to point fingers at one player, because that really feels unfair, and generally it is. Like, there is no game really where one player is so bad in pro that they just, like, instantly lose it. You can win with bad players, but man, Oscar Renan tried his best to insta-lose this game on the Camille. This was horrible from him, and we will talk about that more as we continue onwards. But of course, we talk about the winners first, and that means talking about G2 player of the game. It's going to go to Caps. Man, we were waiting for a performance like this. We were waiting for Caps to just genuinely have a good game from start to finish. And all it took is him bringing out Azir, who, by the way, is meta. He's not out of meta by any means. I see a lot of teams being afraid to go to Azir. We've seen this champion have a ton of success over the course of this year. Basically the entire year. Even had his absolute lowest when he was, like, really, really bad in terms of the solo queue perception. Like, teams were still picking him and still succeeding, so I'm not shocked to see Caps pull him out here and really succeed on it. Really, the only thing I'm shocked by is that Brand Azir can work as a duo into Maokai Corki. That typically feels like something that just wouldn't end up being particularly good. That might be cooking a little bit too much and being a bit too risky, but it did end up working out in this, and a lot of that is just because Caps is so good. The damage he's able to put out, the safety he's able to have for himself, and the aggressive playmaking potential. Caps does have a bit of the LEC Azir syndrome, and the fact that he basically has to go for a Shuriman Shuffle every single time it's even remotely available to him, like every other LEC mid laner. You know, if you're not familiar, I call that the LEC Azir syndrome, but he still was able to pull it off. He was able to make it work, unlike a lot of the other LEC mid laners that end up just inting away on this champion. So credit to Caps. I thought he had a great game, but Mickey X, man, a couple of great engages. This is back-to-back series where he's been such an influential figure. And again, I'm not entirely surprised. I know I've been bashing this guy, and maybe there are a lot of people out there that are like, oh, like you're just changing your tune now because he's playing well and you want to seem like you were on the right side. Like, I can understand that, and if that's what you want to believe, like, go ahead and do your thing, but, like, Mickey showing up in big moments is not something new, but at the same time, it's fair to call out the bad games he had over the course of this year. That being said, this is awesome. Like, I'm glad that he is locking in. I think a lot of it has to be mental. Maybe he just isn't trying as hard in the regular season. Maybe he just isn't trying as hard in, like, best of threes. When these games start to matter more, when the season's on the line, when Worlds qualification's on the line, that's when Mickey starts to play his best, just like he played his best at MSI. And so, you know, hopefully that's going to be a trend that continues, because this was another fantastic rel game from him. And some of those engage angles, he's just really good at finding them and setting them up for the rest of his team. Hans continues to look excellent on Kalista. Yike continues to look excellent on Brand. I'm still shocked that people are giving Yike Brand. That seems to be something that is just kind of a cheat code right now for G2 in the early game. Broken Blade continues to look excellent on Cassante. This is the most stable pick for the top side here for G2. Overall, everyone just kind of looking good, and especially with Caps and Mickey stepping up, that's a very important duo to play well for G2 at the current moment. And for Fnatic on the other side, again, I really don't want to boil it down too simply, because I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's fair to point the fingers at Oscar Renin and be like, you were the problem, but Oscar was really, really bad this game on the Camille. He's gonna get dead of the game. This is a really awkward time for him to be, like, truly awful in the way that he was in this one. Camille is just not the R5 pick. You don't want to take something super aggressive into Cassante, because all they're gonna do is neutralize that pressure on the top side at the very best for you, and then all of a sudden you're just Camille without gold going into the late game trying to be as useful as a Cassante. It's just not really going to work out in your favor in that instance, and then worst case scenario ends up striking, and G2 actually does want to put pressure onto the top side, and Fnatic can't actually answer that. They don't exactly have the damage and the pressure because you're Maokai Corki in the middle of the map, and so Camille is just left on this island and is unable to play the game, and all of a sudden Oscar is super far behind and the champion can be taken advantage of over and over and over again, and now Oscar is actively just being a hindrance to his team. And so I don't really love the Camille pick. I think it very much came back to bite them in this game, but there were more problems. I think Humanoid continues to be much too aggressive on things like Corki. He's just constantly looking to try to make plays in the mid game that aren't real, like that aren't actively good plays, and he gets himself caught out for it for basically no reason. I think Razork, Noah, Jun, they were fine. Noah was a little bit too far forward, but was also targeted quite a bit in this game, so I'm not really going to yell at him too much. This was an Oscar Renin problem, and that's going to have to be fixed. Again, I think both of these teams really are better off just opting into that tank, boring top lane matchup. I think both of them, quite frankly, are just better in those situations, and so I imagine that's the direction that both teams might want to go, but, you know, we'll have to see. We're going into a game number 4, and G2 is now one game away from becoming the 2024 LEC champions, from winning the quad, winning all 4 trophies across the entire year in the LEC, which would be unbelievable. Fnatic has a chance to shut them down, but to do that, they have to win game number 4. They have to keep this series alive, and they have to push us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. Are they going to be able to do that? Well, the winner of game number 4 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 4. They are going to take this series 3-1, and that means your 2024 LEC champions are once again G2 Esports. They won winter, they won spring, they won summer, and now they win the season finals. They have won everything, every single tournament, every single split that has happened so far in the LEC, and I guess not so far, that has happened, that will happen in the LEC in 2024. G2 are your champions of it, and it's just absurd. I mean, there has never been dominance like this in the history of European League of Legends, regardless of whether or not you want to call this like the best European League of Legends team of all time. I'm not quite there. Obviously, you've got some pretty high performances from, 2019 G2 or 2018 Fnatic, or even, some of the teams before that. We're looking at like a 2011 Fnatic if you want to go for like world champion bait. Like, there are European League of Legends teams that have done more internationally, but Has there ever been domestic dominance like what we have seen so far from G2? This is 7 titles in 8 tournaments. Like, this is just unparalleled domination from G2. And Fnatic, you know, they tried their best to stand up to it, but they don't have the firepower to do so. They have pretty clear character flaws that we saw in this series that we will definitely talk about, but G2 are your champions, and they have earned every single bit of praise that they are going to get from this moving forward. But enough talk about the grandiose things, let's get into the actual conversation around game number 4 and just generally the takeaways from this series, because it is closing out the LEC in 2024, so we might as well give it its just due. My player of the game here in game number 4 and my finals MVP, my player of the series, is going to once again go to Hansama in the bot lane, this time on the Jhin. Hansama's ridiculous. I mean, again, I can't stress enough just how much this guy steps up in these big moments, just how much he is able to create for this team when they need him the most. He's not always the most consistent in the regular season. Hell, he's not the most consistent internationally. That's kind of been the big question mark when it comes to Hansama, but when you need a guy to show up in the LEC finals, Hansama is the guy to go ahead and do that, and so you've got to be very excited for G2. Hopefully this means good things for their bot lane moving forward because they were so good in this series. Hopefully that means that's something they can build upon and really become like one of the better bot lanes at Worlds. That's kind of the hope for them. Obviously, I'll believe it when I see it when it comes to these players who have not necessarily performed internationally, but Hans was so good domestically in the playoffs all year long. He had obviously some ups and downs in the regular season. He clearly wasn't locked in the same way that I don't think players like, you know, Humanoid or Razork or Noah were always locked in on the other side of this matchup. You're just not really getting that. Mickey X wasn't always locked in for G2. It's just not how the LEC operates. A lot of these players don't really care all that much about the regular season, and so it can become relatively difficult to evaluate them. But when you have a player like Hansama who very consistently steps up in these big stadium arena LEC finals, you have to take that into account, and that's something that is really impressive to me. Mickey also had a great series. Really happy to be able to say that again. Copy and paste everything I said in game number 3 here to game number 4. A lot of great engages, and generally speaking, as long as he is locked in and not just stepping forward and dying for no reason, he's putting his team in better positions simply by existing. He really is that good. Broken Blade was awesome here in game number 4. The Cassante is just such a cheat code pick for G2. It does everything that, you know, Broken Blade wants to do. They often rely on him to be more passive, somebody that can play weak side and, you know, play more of that tanky role that plays for team fights, but they also want to give him some agency in those fights themselves. They don't want to just completely take away his ability to take over 5v5s, and so something like Cassante fits super well with that ideology, and he executes on it well every time. Yike gets another brand game. Teams just are not willing to take that away. Caps even gets to play Azir once again after the great game number 3. Everybody kind of gets to play the big hits here for G2, and they're able to walk out with a win because of it. All 5 of these members obviously deserve it, but for Fnatic on the other side, this is a heartbreaking loss. It's yet another one to add to the collection of finals that you just have not been able to grasp. You've won, what, 2 of the last 18 finals, I think is the stat I saw, and both of those were with Caps before he left for G2, and so it's just been a pretty bad run of things for Fnatic. That is certainly the case. Dud of the game here in game 4 is going to go to Razork, and really kind of the general theme and the takeaway from this series for Fnatic is that their macro is just really, really bad, and we kind of already knew that. We knew that going into this tournament because they were really not good at macro in the playoffs either. In fact, it's what cost them the Summer Split title. They probably should have been the Summer Split champions, but their macro was really poor in that series against G2 in the finals there. It ended up costing them game 3. It really came back to bite them with G2 just out macroing them. Game 1, it was kind of a problem as well, but even here in game 4, this slower paced game where they really should have the advantage of being able to move the Ziggs around the map and create tower pressure that way, they just fail to utilize it. They fail to capitalize on the thing that their comp is supposed to do, and their lack of understanding of how to specifically utilize the tools that they have at their disposal rather than just kind of the generic tools that you would use in any game. Like, their failure to recognize that, I think, is really what held them back in this performance. Obviously, Noah tried his best, but he really didn't. Like, he was sitting mid lane all game and just catching waves. That is the opposite of what I want my Ziggs to be doing in the early to mid game. I want him everywhere else. I want him in the top lane. I want him in the bot lane. I want him on every single turret in the game trying to take it. G2 wasn't even defending them all that well. It really was Fnatic that just didn't really have a huge effort or a huge push to try and get any of those towers, which is the most disappointing part. Part of that that falls on Razork because, as far as I'm aware, he is the primary shot caller in the early game for this team, but, you know, his team fighting was also bad enough to earn him dead of the game, which just, it is what it is. Humanoid was fine, generally, this series on the Corki. I barely even said Jun's name over the course of this series. Oscar Rinnin was a bit of a problem in games 1 and 3, but I guess he didn't get obliterated on the Renekton in game 4. It's just, it feels like Fnatic is close, but not close enough. And this is just generally what I've continued to feel. I've gotten some hate in the comment section because I say that G2 is just ahead of every other team in the LEC, but they kind of are. And I hate to say it, right now it doesn't feel like a lot of that is G2 being incredibly good. It feels like every other team in the LEC having such a major defined weakness that they just can't overcome. And unfortunately for Fnatic, they just can't stop getting in their own way. This is a team that had the potential to be a team that could take a title or take a split or, you know, actively compete with G2 to win the season finals here, but they've just never realized that potential, and I hate to say it, but honestly, at this point, I just don't expect them to. I don't expect this team to suddenly figure it out and become a team that I think could make top 8 at Worlds. I don't see that pathway for them until they get out of their own way, and this core has been together way too long for me to expect that change to just randomly happen overnight at this point. And so for Fnatic, while there are good things to take away from this, I think the Game 2 win was solid. You honestly probably should have won Game number 1. There are also so many negatives that it leads me to walk out of this series feeling probably the same way they do, a lot more dejected about this loss than they probably did about the summer finals. And then for G2, like I said, congratulations to this team. They're going as the number 1 seed at Worlds. That's not a surprise. In fact, if it was anything else, it probably would have been a bit unfortunate for G2 having won every single, split across the year. For them not to go as the number 1 seed would be absolutely ridiculous, but they are going to be the number 1 seed for the LEC. Not that that particularly matters in the Swiss stage, but they have earned the spot of being considered the LEC's number 1 team by a country mile, and at this point, it's going to take a mountain to dethrone them, really at any point. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LEC season finals, semifinals, and finals overview and analysis video, and that's going to do it for my LEC coverage here in 2024. That is the last domestic series that we cover, the last domestic game that we cover, and that will happen throughout the year. So I do hope you guys enjoyed the coverage. We covered every single game of the LEC in 2024, all the way from the start of the winter split down here to the final series of the season finals. If you guys enjoyed it along the way, it really would mean a lot to me if you hit the like button. Obviously, I do this for you guys. I mean, as much as I enjoy watching League of Legends, making the videos and being able to share this with the community, and hopefully you guys enjoyed it as well. It's always good to get thoughts and opinions out there. It takes a lot of work, a lot of effort to go through, every single one of these games. For the LEC, it's a little bit easier just because of the format. There aren't as many like best of 3s and best of 5s as maybe there are in some other regions, but still always a grind to make sure I get these videos out on time, to make sure I'm getting my thoughts across clearly to you guys. And I know we might not always agree. I know there are going to be big disagreements, and my takes on the LEC are often not the most popular in the entire world, but if you've stuck around the entire year, honestly, it means the world. If you guys have watched all of the videos, even if you haven't, if you just enjoyed this one, it means a lot to me that you checked this one out, and I really do appreciate it. But again, congratulations to G2. It's no surprise that they're standing on the podium at the end of the day, but still impressive nonetheless that 7 of the last 8 have gone in their favor. But now that we've wrapped up the LEC, upcoming, it's going to be Worlds coverage. Of course, we're still covering the other regions. LCS and LCK playoffs are still going on. NACL, Tier 2 over in North America, their playoffs are still going on. There's still quite a few things to be determined, quite a few things to talk about left, but Worlds is on the horizon, and that's the next time we are going to be talking about these LEC teams. If you want to know my thoughts on how I think these LEC teams, how I think G2 and Fnatic and Mad Lions are going to do at the World Championships, stick around on this channel. Hit subscribe and hit that bell, because I will be posting a lot of pre-Worlds coverage, team power rankings, player power rankings, expectations, bracket predictions. All of that stuff is going to be on this channel once we know all of the stuff for Worlds. Once all of the teams are locked in, once all of the regions are done, all of that content will be here. So if you are interested in hearing that from me, really would mean a lot to me if you hit subscribe and hit that bell. But again, if you're just here for the LEC stuff, I really do appreciate you being along for the ride. It's been a fun 2024, but it comes to an end here. So with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all